Now, to continue on from the last video, an important point, and perhaps one of the most important takeaways from all this, is that knowledge or our understanding of reality has to be grounded in some kind of spiritual experience. It's not simply enough to know of a given reality, one has to be able to experience it directly. And without that fundamental experience, that fundamental ecstasy, so to speak, one's knowledge is, or one's understanding of reality rather, it's kind of dry. It's not moist with the water of life, so to speak. Now, for those of you who are more secular minded or perhaps are more agnostic, I may be using spirituality here a bit loosely. And there's an important point to be made here that the Western Academy, what it tends to overlook, is that the intellect itself has its limitations. The intellect itself, has a kind of fallible nature to it. And so simply relying upon the intellect or one's knowledge is not enough to give one certainty or to grant one, let's say, a kind of firmness in his or her worldview. And, like I've mentioned, there's an infinite number of facts and variables and things that one has to consider. And really and truly, you can never be fully certain of reality as it is, insofar as human capabilities are fallible and limited. Where spirituality or where spiritual practices come into this is it begins where the intellect ends, so to speak. Spirituality grants a person, or spiritual practices rather, grants a person experience of reality, a kind of connection to the outside world, a kind of connection to his inner feelings, his inner self, his soul, or his sort of more spiritual nature, if you want to call it that. And it grants him a connection towards his inner consciousness, and it grants him a kind of relationship to the outside world via contemplation and reflection, which he cannot perhaps merely gain from learning or from, using his intellect. This is why so many of the great spiritual teachers of the world, both historically and in a contemporary sense, advocate for these kinds of spiritual practices. This is why meditation, simply just sitting still, just accepting sort of existence as it is, contemplating upon existence, building your relationship with yourself, with your inner soul, so to speak, is so emphasized. And, this kind of the hustle and bustle of life, right, the very materialistic activities we undertake, may distract us from contemplating upon the nature of ourselves, upon the nature of reality, and hence why these meditative practices, right, these prayers, these rituals are emphasized in almost every single religion. For example, there is the kind of philosophical, metaphysical thinking about things, and there is also the more mechanical, kind of materialistic, scientific way about thinking of things. But then there is a kind of irrational, mysterious aspect to human existence. This irrational, mysterious nature of man's existence, this kind of mystery surrounding it, it's a thing which requires a lot of contemplation to try to understand, and not one which can merely be understood through the mind or through empirical observation. And hence, this is why spiritual practices and spirituality become so important to try and understand this aspect of human existence better. A few examples that I could give of where perhaps, people or academics, scholars, or great thinkers really, who didn't engage in this kind of spiritual practice and contemplation where it went wrong for them. For example, we can talk about the great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and many like him, right? Many of these great thinkers from the Enlightenment and post Enlightenment era, who, despite their genius and ingenuity, no doubt, they went they kind of went mentally ill or insane, many of them, or at the very least they were incredibly depressed and nihilistic in their outview. And that's because, they tried to seek the truth, they tried to seek to understand reality, but they ignored a very important aspect of trying to reach said reality, which is said spiritual contemplation and practice. And of course, it's not as simple as, they didn't worship God or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. A lot of these thinkers had genuine, mental health conditions and genuine mental illnesses. But I think, when yeah, like I've said, when there's no spirituality, when there's no kind of spiritual practice to go alongside one's knowledge, one does succumb to this kind of nihilism, right? To this kind of uncertainty about knowing the truth. And that leads to this kind of mental breakdown, this kind of mental anguish for a lot of these thinkers. A more contemporary example that I can think of is somebody like Jordan Peterson, right? And despite, being as, incredible and influential of a thinker as he has been, and, by no means do I support all of his views, I think some of the things he's said are rather abhorrent. And unfortunately, he's gotten lost to the culture wars, right? But without a doubt, I think he deserves some sympathy for his mental breakdown and his, mental condition. But arguably, that, just goes to show that no matter how intelligent a person is, no matter how much knowledge one has, no matter how strong one's intellect is, without some kind of spirituality, you will always succumb to a kind of mental anguish, a kind of mental uncertainty, a kind of nihilism. What's interesting is to parallel this with many of the great theologians of various religious traditions. An important example is that of Al-Ghazali, who is generally considered the sort of greatest thinker of the Islamic Sunni tradition, especially. Similar to many of these great thinkers, Al-Ghazali had this kind of mental breakdown, this mental anguish that caused him to abandon teaching and, abandon his sort of societal roles, right? Because due to his depth of study and due to his great intellect, he studied various different ideas, various different arguments, and he felt that he couldn't obtain certainty, right? He felt into this kind of shukuk, these kinds of doubts, right? And that prevented him from having this kind of mental certainty, which inevitably led to anguish, mental anguish, and a kind of mental breakdown. And he had what you could say, an existential crisis. That's the right term there. And similar to many of these great philosophers that I've just mentioned, Al-Ghazali went through this period of life where he couldn't solve some of the most pertinent questions relating to him, as some of the most pertinent philosophical questions of the age, and as a result, he fell into this kind of existential crisis. What helped Al-Ghazali out of this was tasawwuf, was this kind of Islamic Sufism, spirituality, so to speak. Spiritual practices, spirituality is what helped him, restore his confidence. Not in a dogmatic sense, right? I'm not talking about dogma. I'm not talking about blind following, but rather about the basic certainty of man's existence in this world and his need to act, so to speak. And obviously, with Islamic context, man's need to be the representative of the divine on this earth and to lead a virtuous life. And so Al-Ghazali, sort of realized that via spiritual contemplation and via spiritual sort of reflection and practice, one could attain some degree of certainty which couldn't be found merely by intellectual endeavors or, just studying knowledge. Another interesting example is Thomas Aquinas, who, despite all of his magnum opuses in theology and philosophy, at the end of his life, he had this kind of spiritual experience. And he said, and he kind of reminisced that, all of the things that I've studied and all of the things that I've written, they're not even like the drop of an ocean compared to what I've experienced. In other words, spiritual experience, direct experience of reality, grants a person this kind of mental assurance that mere studying cannot. This, of course, does not mean that, one should abandon intellectual endeavors or studying knowledge or learning or writing. That's not at all what I'm saying. But the point to be made here is that, quite loosely or more broadly speaking, this kind of spiritual experience, or rather experiencing reality, experiencing the various facets and aspects of reality as they are, is crucial for a scholar, for a thinker to better understand reality. One cannot simply get caught up into this kind of ivory tower where he's merely thinking about things in a very intellectual or a very knowledge based or ilmi manner, because the limits of human knowledge and the fallible nature of the intellect are well known, and hence by themselves they will not grant man mental assurance, and they alone will not prevent this kind of existential crisis. What will help a man alongside these things, right, not leaving these things out, but alongside them, is this kind of spiritual endeavoring, is this kind of spiritual experiencing, is this kind of spirituality that will help to explain the irrational, emotional, intimate, and ultimately mysterious aspects of human existence.